Welcome back to POLISCI Files, everyone. I'm so excited for this deep dive because it's a book that's been on my list forever. David Harvey's The Enigma of Capital and the Crises of Capitalism.
Oh, fantastic choice. Harvey's work is always so insightful, especially if you're trying to understand those moments when it feels like the whole economic system is teetering on the edge.
Exactly. It's like he has this X-ray vision, where he can spot the weaknesses and cracks in capitalism that most of us miss. But before we go any further, can you give us a little background on David Harvey himself, for anyone who might not be familiar with his work?
Absolutely. David Harvey is a geographer and social theorist. Really a giant in the field. He's known for his work on all sorts of things, but mainly for understanding capitalism, urbanization, and social justice. And what makes his work so powerful is that it helps us see how these big, complex systems actually shape our world, on a day-to-day basis.
So he's not just an academic kind of like theorizing in a vacuum. His work really has real-world implications.
Exactly. And The Enigma of Capital is a perfect example of that. It came out in 2010, right after the 2008 financial crisis, and it offers a really powerful analysis of why these crises seem to keep happening. Why it feels like they're not just one-off events, but part of a larger pattern.
Yeah, I remember feeling like the world was falling apart back then. And the way Harvey opens the book with this gripping account of 2008, it really pulls you in. It seems like he's using that crisis almost like a launch pad to explore his broader ideas about capitalism.
You got it. He starts with this very vivid anecdote about how the crisis reached those typical white middle-class neighborhoods in the U.S., South and West, mostly through foreclosures. It became a real crisis for a lot of people because suddenly it wasn't something happening over there to someone else.
Right, like it was no longer possible to ignore it when it hit closer to home for so many people.
Exactly. And that leads him right to his main point. These recurring crises, they're not just accidents or anomalies. They're literally built into the system of capitalism.
So he's saying that these crashes are practically baked into the cake. Kind of unsettling, isn't it? Does that mean he thinks another crisis is inevitable?
Well, he makes a very compelling case by looking at history. He points out all these other similar crises going way back, like the global property market crash in 1973, before the oil crisis even hit. And that had massive ripple effects. Even cities like New York almost went bankrupt.
Really? I had no idea it happened even before the oil crisis. Wow, that domino effect is crazy. So what other examples does he give?
He goes through a whole list. The Japanese boom in the 1980s ended with their stock market crashing, land prices went way down. Then in 1992, Sweden had to nationalize their entire banking system because their property market was so out of control. Even the East and Southeast Asian financial crisis back in 1997-98, which was fueled by too much urban development, is on his list.
Wow. So it's like capitalism keeps tripping over its own feet. Are all these crises basically the same in his view? Like, what's the common thread running through them?
Harvey's argument is that this isn't just bad luck. There's something in how capitalism works that keeps causing these breakdowns. And he calls that capital's enigma. It's the focus of Chapter 3.
Capital's enigma. Okay, you've piqued my interest. What is the mystery here?
The enigma is this. Capitalism always has to find ways to invest its profits to make even more profit. Huge amounts of capital are constantly looking for somewhere to go. Harvey calls this the surplus absorption problem.
So it's like this constantly growing monster that needs to be fed more and more capital or it starves.
A very good way to put it. And this insatiable need for profit, it drives so much of what we see in the world. The innovation, the technology, yeah, but also the exploitation, the environmental damage. It's a strange mix of good and bad.
Okay, I see the dilemma. But historically, how has this surplus absorption played out? Has it always been this way?
That's the really clever part of Harvey's analysis. He looks at how capitalism has tried different strategies to handle this excess capital over time. Early on, you see things like colonial expansion, just taking resources from other places, even violence. He talks about primitive accumulation. And in the book, he says, the history of capitalism has been characterized by waves of expansion by dispossession. It's a pretty brutal picture.
So capitalism's early days were even more ruthless than we realize.
Well, he argues that even though those tactics might seem less obvious now, they're still around, just in more complex forms. But as those strategies become less effective or less acceptable, capitalism has to find new ways to keep going, to keep growing.
So if not colonial expansion and just grabbing resources, what comes next?
I-
How does capitalism evolve to deal with all that extra capital?
That's where things get really interesting. But I think we should save that for after a quick break. Stay tuned. So where were we?
Oh, yeah, capitalism needing to constantly find new ways to reinvest all that profit, right? All that extra capital. Right. And you were about to tell us how it evolves, like how it changes its strategies over time.
Well, that's where Harvey really digs deep. He says it's not enough to just look at the economics of it all. We have to understand how capitalism shapes and is shaped by all these different aspects of how we live.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Go on.
He lays this all out in Chapter 4 with what he calls 7 spheres of activity. It's a framework for seeing the bigger picture.
7 spheres. Okay, I'm all ears. What are they?
First, you've got technologies and organizational forms, and we already touched on that a bit with things like how finance has changed, right? Then there's production and labor processes. Basically, that's how we make stuff and who's doing the work. After that comes social relations, so things like family structures, gender roles, how different classes interact. It's all connected.
Wow, it's really a wide range. What else is there?
Next comes mental conceptions of the world. That's basically our ideologies, our beliefs, how we make sense of everything around us. Then you have the sphere of daily life and reproduction. That's focusing on how we live, what we consume, how we keep the whole social order going.
Okay, so like our habits and routines and the consumer society, all that.
Exactly. And we can't forget the relationship to nature, which is crucial these days with all the environmental problems we're facing. That's the 6th sphere. And finally, you've got institutional and administrative arrangements, things like governments, legal systems, all those structures of power.
It's so comprehensive. It's like he's saying you can't separate capitalism from any part of life, really.
Precisely. It's intertwined with everything. And the really fascinating part is that these spheres are all interacting, always in flux. Harvey says that when you have innovation or change in one sphere, it has ripple effects across the others. It's what he calls co-evolutionary change.
Okay, I get the idea. It's like this big web, right? You tug on one strand and the whole thing moves. But do you have an example of how this plays out in the real world?
Sure. Think of the Green Revolution in agriculture. Harvey talks about it in Chapter 6. Now, on the surface, it looked like an amazing breakthrough. New crops that yielded way more food, helping feed a growing population. But when you look at it through the lens of those 7 spheres, a different story emerges.
Wait, are you saying the Green Revolution, which most people think was a positive thing, had a dark side?
That's the point. It shows how even something seemingly positive can have all these unintended consequences. Like, those new crops needed tons of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, which really hurt the environment. And it shifted power dynamics in rural areas, often displacing small farmers and leading to big landowners getting even more land.
So it actually worsened existing inequalities on top of the environmental damage. It's almost like a mini version of capitalism itself. You have any other examples where these connections, these ripple effects, are really visible?
Tons. Take the automobile, something Harvey discusses in Chapter 5. We often see it as a symbol of freedom and progress, being able to go wherever you want. But it also forced us to make these huge changes to infrastructure. Suddenly you had suburban sprawl, dependence on oil, public transportation declined. It didn't just change how we got around, it changed where we lived, how we worked, even how we socialized.
Wow, it's crazy to think something so ordinary like having a car could have such profound impacts.
Exactly. And these impacts, these ripple effects across different parts of life. That's what Harvey means by uneven geographical development. It's another key concept in his work. Capitalism doesn't affect every place the same way. Some places boom, others decline, and that creates those big inequalities we see everywhere.
That's so true. You can see it all around us, like Silicon Valley thriving while the Rust Belt struggles, or those mega cities in developing countries that are growing so fast, but their rural areas are left behind. So how does Harvey think we should make sense of all this?
He says we have to understand how geography actually shapes the flow of capital, and how that in turn shapes the landscape. Not just the physical landscape, but the social and economic landscape, too. He even writes, capitalism is a perpetually restless system forever seeking out new territories.
So it's not just about some abstract economic forces. It's about real places, real people, real lives. I see how these ideas are coming together now. But if capitalism is always on the hunt for new territories, new profits, doesn't that mean this cycle of boom and bust, this uneven development, it's just going to keep happening? Is that inevitable?
That's a big question, and it's one that Harvey really grapples with in the last part of the book. He wants to know if there's any way out of this mess, any way to break the cycle. So, yeah, that's the big question, right? Can we actually break this cycle? Is there any way to make things more fair, more sustainable?
I mean, it's pretty overwhelming to think about. Does Harvey offer any solutions, or are we all doomed?
He definitely doesn't pretend it's going to be easy. But he doesn't give up on hope either. In the last few chapters, he really focuses on what can be done, and he sees social movements as a really key force for change.
Oh, interesting. So he's not saying we should just wait for politicians to fix everything, or that we need some huge top-down revolution. He's more focused on what people are doing on the ground.
Exactly. He points out that throughout history, it's always been social movements that have really pushed for progress, that have challenged those in power, like the labor movement, fighting for workers' rights, trying to get a fairer distribution of wealth, and the environmental movement, obviously raising awareness of how capitalism impacts the planet.
Yeah, those are great examples. But they faced a lot of resistance, right?
Yeah.
Changing things isn't easy.
Absolutely. Harvey acknowledges that. Anyone who tries to change the status quo is going to run into roadblocks. People who benefit from the current system aren't going to just give up their power. He even writes this, and it's a great line, "The ruling class never willingly cedes power." So he's saying we have to be ready for a fight. We have to be organized and be willing to confront power directly.
So it's not just about having the right ideas.
Hmm.
It's about having enough people power to actually make those ideas a reality.
Right. And he also makes the point that it's not just about opposing things, about tearing down the old system. It's about building something new, something better. He talks about the need for utopian thinking, not in some naive way, but as a way to imagine possibilities, to break free from the limits of what we think is possible.
I love that. Utopian thinking. It's about daring to dream a little, right? Not just accepting things as they are.
Exactly. He thinks we need that kind of vision to really motivate people, to inspire real change.
Okay, so thinking big, thinking differently. But what are some concrete steps we can take? Where do we even begin to address these massive systemic problems?
Well, Harvey points to a lot of things happening on the ground already that give him hope. Things like alternative economies that are based on cooperation and sustainability and social justice, worker cooperatives, community-owned businesses, even those local trading systems, they're all out there.
So it's about showing that there are other ways to do things, other ways to organize our lives and our economies.
Yeah. He sees these as kind of seeds for a different kind of future. He also talks about the degrowth movement, which challenges the idea that we always need more economic growth, that growth is always good.
Degrowth, that's a pretty radical idea, isn't it? It goes against everything we've been taught.
It does. But it's getting more attention as people realize that this model of endless growth just isn't sustainable for the planet. It's about changing our values, putting well-being above material wealth, and making sure resources are distributed fairly.
So, like, what if our goal wasn't just to produce more and more stuff, but to live better lives within the limits of the planet?
Exactly. And another thing Harvey talks about is reclaiming the commons, resisting the idea that everything should be privatized, owned by corporations. We need to protect those public goods and resources that should benefit everyone.
The commons. Things like public parks, libraries, clean water, even the internet. Those should be available to everybody, not just those who can afford it.
Right. He sees that as super important for a more just and sustainable future.
This is all so fascinating, but also, I have to admit, a little overwhelming. These are huge problems, and I'm just one person,
Harvey knows that. He reminds us that a lot of change happens at the local level. Get involved in your community, support initiatives that you believe in, fight for policies that promote social justice and sustainability.
So it's not about waiting for some big revolution. It's about taking action right now, wherever we are.
Yeah. And he believes all those local efforts, when they come together as part of broader movements, they can create a real wave of change. A change that can transform the system from the inside out.
A wave of change. I like that image. I'm definitely feeling more hopeful after spending time with Harvey's work. It's not a simple roadmap, but it's a powerful call to action, to think critically and to get involved in creating a better world.
Me too. The Enigma of Capital is definitely a challenging book, but it's so worth reading. It's full of insights that can help us make sense of what's happening around us, and it gives us hope that we can actually change things for the better.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us here on Policy Files. If you want to learn more about David Harvey's work, we highly recommend checking out his book, The Enigma of Capital and the Crises of Capitalism. You won't regret it. And as always, keep thinking critically.